Welcome back to another episode of Media Talks TV. I'm Tony J. Hope everybody had a great Valentine's Day weekend. You know, guess wasn't too much to celebrate anyway. But I really wanted to jump into this conversation that I'm about to put out in the open because I've had my thoughts over the weekend and I did a lot of thinking, but I've come to the point where I personally cannot stand anybody from New York City. Now, I'm not saying New Yorkers are bad people. I'm not saying that, you know, I hate New Yorkers, but right now and at this moment, I realize New York City has had such a big influence in American media that it just will not go away. And I was sitting back and I was watching CNN and many other also News Nation, and they talk about New York now with a different bent than how they talked about New York City 25 years ago when 9/11 happened. Everybody is back to really hating on New York City. A lot of people who don't live there have said New York is a curse on us all for those who can't live there and for those who tried to live there and can no longer afford it, which is one primary reason why New York City got Zoran Mamdani. But just last week, they just opened up this free grocery store in New York City, in Brooklyn, I believe, called the Polymark or the Poly Market grocery store, a free grocery store. And it's kind of like this grand experiment that's happening, that's taking place in New York City, where we're starting to see socialist values start to be implemented, and we're starting to see New York shift from this corporate culture that it was always known for to back to working class people that want the city back. But New York City has become something of a symbol of what is wrong with the United States and why New York is actually representative of what's going on in America currently when we talk about the economy. Now, I'll jump into the cultural stuff later in this discussion, but I really want to talk about the economic piece because so many people don't really understand what's going on. With New York shifting from more, well, less corporate to being more socialistic in their policies with the election of Mayor Mandani, we're seeing an experiment take place. And if it can't work in New York City, then it can't work anywhere else. But we're seeing a younger crop of politicians coming into the frame to change what has always been a problem for Gen Z, and that is the issue of affordability. And New York City has probably got to be the most unaffordable city to live in. Hence, why a lot of people dislike New York. But there's a lot of other things about New York that we don't think about have contributed to the entire nation. And, you know, when we talk about American history, being that this is the 250th anniversary of our country, we can't forget that New York City contributed so much to public policy, which in certain frames, whether you believe it or not, have been failures. Um, when you go back to the early 1930s, um, New York City was the very first city to implement what we now know as public housing. And of course, that came out of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the time that he was governor of New York. But then came the public theater, which was another institution that came out of New York, and then public works, and then the building of bridges by a man that we know as um I forgot I forgot his name, but clue me in the description box. Um what was his name? He built bridges, and then we got highways and roads and whatnot. But the problem is that through all of this building of New York City and the history that came along with it, we also had in the 70s austerity politics and the problems with New York City going bankrupt because of those politics. New York is an experiment, and if it fails, the whole entire country fails with it. So everything is really like tied to New York City in a lot of ways. Economic wise, what Zoran Mamdani is doing is just reinventing the wheel, but we don't know how long it's going to take before it actually works. And with the economic piece, we're seeing kind of New York City at a crossroads. But here's the cultural piece that is the one primary reason politically New York doesn't get as much fanfare as a lot of other American cities. One of the things about New York City as a character is a character city. So when you talk about the personalities that come out of New York City, they're mostly going to be very arrogant, very snobbish, and elitist. And they held that the people in New York City have held that type of mentality for a long time at the behest of people that never lived in New York or don't live in New York. They had a strong, overwhelming influence on American culture that we can't really talk about American history unless we talk about New York City in the process. So with that elitism that New York has always been known for, now you see the class differences if you step outside of the city. Most New Yorkers can't afford New York. That's the reality. But one of the things that I haven't really discussed about New York City is when a lot of New Yorkers decide to leave and they take that influence with them to other cities or to other countries. And because of that influence and because of the arrogance, most people down south don't like New Yorkers or people who are from New York. I went to school with a lot of New York people. A lot of them Brooklyn, Queens, and Harlem. Sometimes the Bronx, but most of the people, most of my friends, they came from Brooklyn or Harlem. And they I was a student at Morgan State early 2008, right? I got to know some of these people. Some of them were decent, some of them good, but I often scratch my head and ask myself, with a lot of New Yorkers, what made them want to leave New York and go to college in another state? And that's one of the biggest issues that I started noticing even when I went to school. You know, why go to another state when you got free college tuition in your home state and then got some of the best colleges in New York? I mean, you got Fordham, you got Cooney, uh, the state of New York College, you got Ithaca. You have some of the top colleges. There are more colleges between New York City and New York State. Baruch College, New York Institute of Technology. You have all these colleges and also famously New York University and Columbia. So you got all these colleges and then you got an Ivy League. Why in the world would you want to leave your home state or your city to want to go to another college in another state? And I know people going to be like, well, it's more affordable or it's the experience. But I never understood why a lot of New Yorkers wanted to come to Baltimore and wanted to attend college in Baltimore. And then I remember when I was going to school and the New York kids, the New York students would ask me, "Oh, where you from?" "Oh, I'm from Baltimore." And then they would ask me a stupid ass question like, "Is it really like The Wire?" And I realized because New York has had influence over a lot of cities, the stupidest question I ever got was from a New Yorker's mouth was, "Is Baltimore like The Wire?" And I'm like, yes and no. But what is your curiosity? Why do you want to come down here? Because you saw a couple of episodes of The Wire? So now you want to fucking come down here? Never cease to amaze me how one TV show had this much influence and curiosity over a bunch of New York kids. When in reality, if you look at The Wire, majority of the people that played in The Wire were from New York, mainly from the Bronx. Tristan Wilds is from Co-op City, Bronx. So a lot of those guys that played on that show were from New York. It's weird when I see New Yorkers, they come out of this city, and it's like they also live in a Shiloh, I mean a silo of their own, because most New Yorkers don't really know anything outside of New York. So they approach life when they get out of New York and they go down south, or they go further south, like places like North Carolina and Georgia, and they don't know how to conduct themselves. They're not used to living with a lot of space. And being that I'm a southerner myself, you know, it's something that you definitely get used to when you get out of the city, and then you go down south, and it's a lot more space. People have backyards. People have backyard parties and grills and stuff like that. Whereas though somebody, a typical New Yorker, they grill out on a fucking fire escape, or they grill out on the sidewalk and they play with uh, street hoses and street hydrants and shit. Whereas though we could have southern folk, we got backyards and we got pools or kiddie pools in our backyard. So that's the stock difference between people from New York. They're not accustomed to that. And but there's also this bent of arrogance that I know about New Yorkers, that they feel like everything in life has to be approached in a expedient, fast way to do things. And that's one of the biggest problems with New Yorkers, is that New Yorkers think like they're still in the city when they're not down. They don't know how to adjust to Southern ways of thinking. And I think that's always been an issue throughout American history. Um, I read an article about Frederick Law Olmsted, and he was leaving New York to go down south, and he wasn't accustomed to being down south. And his approach to everything was kind of like a Yankee. And this is where you get that mentality, the dislike for Northeasterners it comes from really pre-Civil War times. And with pre-Civil War times, the way people thought back then about Northerners is that they kind of carried themselves in a rude and arrogant way, or they had all this education, so they didn't know Southern manners and how to approach things. And I read about Frederick Law Olmsted and how he went down south. There was a story about him going down south, and he had a dislike for Southerners, and the Southerners didn't like him because he was well educated and well put together and spoke proper English, and the Southerners were not used to having highly educated aristocrats around them. So it created this animosity between Southerners and Northerners, and how we viewed the Northeast as being very elitist and overly educated. And it seems like it rings true even today with New Yorkers. It's a level of arrogance that people have tolerated for a long time, but have grown more and more impatient as time goes by about New York and their politics and how they're trying to force their politics onto the whole entire nation. Same thing happened when disco became popular. Disco and Latin hustle became a popular thing in New York City because it was a mixture of blacks, Latinos, and gays. And a lot of that stuff, they started rejecting it because it was too classy. People were paying exorbitant amounts of money to go to nightclubs and discos and dress up in disco clothes and polyester and shit. And Southerners rejected that type of mentality mainly because they didn't like New Yorkers, because New Yorkers weren't seen as working class. They were always seen as being decadent and rude and obnoxious and forcing their way of life on other people that didn't want it. Because New York City is such a super diverse place to live. Thing about New York is New Yorkers get spoiled with a lot of options because every neighborhood is different and every flavor is different. And then you have the foods that are very flavorful and different. So you get that diversity, whereas though down south, everybody has their own respective neighborhoods that they stick to by themselves. They don't cross into other people's neighborhoods, you know. But in relation to the previous videos that I made, I talked about Dominican Republic and what I've seen down there as to why I cannot stand people from New York, because New York has had an overwhelming impact on Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. And when I was thinking about this whole Bad Bunny situation, I was asking myself, the Super Bowl was a couple weeks ago, and you know, I was thinking about this whole Bad Bunny thing, and I'm like, I don't understand who this guy is or what the fuck he's saying, but why is there such an overhyping or politicizing of this individual? And it just seemed like Puerto Rico for a long time had their influence in New York for a long time. That got superseded by the Dominican Republic, and now Dominican Republic is seen as being a lot more, having a lot bigger influence over New York City now than Puerto Ricans did back in the 90s. But, you know, when I took my trip to Dominican Republic, and actually this is going to kind of go right back into the issue I had with the passport bros and why this is a very big issue when thinking about New Yorkers that travel all around the world. You got a lot of people that go from New York to Santo Domingo, New York to Santiago, and they do it all the time. And what I noticed when I was hanging around a lot of New York people when I went to Sosua is New Yorkers always feel like they have to stand out everywhere that they go. I've never liked that. I've never liked New Yorkers, especially in the Dominican Republic, because it's like it corrupted, like New Yorkers have really corrupted the whole island of Dominican Republic. It's like there's this New York City Dominican connection where the women have this mentality that the people that's coming down there have money. But it just seemed like because New York has had an overwhelming influence on the Dominican Republic, people are now starting to see that they don't like the outlandish behavior that a lot of people are bringing to the island. And, you know, I started to see certain aspects of New York City in Dominican Republic because me myself, I've been to New York City. So I know how New York is. I've been uptown, so I know the difference between Harlem and Midtown Manhattan. And I know the difference between that and Brooklyn. Not every New Yorker is the same, and I wouldn't put everybody in the same basket. Harlem people, they tend to be very extroverted, very show off. A lot of uptown people are very, very flashy. If they coming from Harlem, if they coming from the Bronx, everything about them is going to be about flash, being flashy. And you go to Dominican Republic, and it just seems like you see that bear out on more strict, um, a more strict example with the party lifestyle that goes on in Dominican Republic, and also with the BBLs and the wine and bottle service people buy at these nightclubs. So you see that all the time because DR is kind of like a conservative country, and they put an emphasis on family. There's kind of like you starting to notice this tension going on between Dominicans and expats that come from that region. And even looking at a lot of the vloggers online, I started to notice that as well. Whenever people come out of New York, they bring the New York mentality with them. And I can't stand the New York mentality because, being that I'm from Maryland and Maryland is the South, whether you believe it or not, I don't like to be around people that flash money, cars, material things, talking big about certain shit, always want to be the center of attention, always trying to bring attention to themselves. I don't like being like that. I've never been like that, and I don't like people that act like that. Southern folk are very different. Now, well, especially where really Virginia and Maryland are very different. We're a mixture of laid back. Well, it's a lot of people from Maryland, Virginia, and DC are very laid back people. They don't have a problem with partying, but they don't want to do the flashy shit. And that's what I noticed about us as Marylanders, as people from DC and Virginia. We don't do the flashy shit that New York does. New York is always about flash. It's always about showing out. Those are the type of people I don't like having around me because they bring too much attention to themselves and to other people. I don't hang around people like that. But of course, you got a lot of New York people in Dominican Republic, and a lot of people starting to be turned off by that mentality. And that's one primary reason I don't like New York. I used to like New Yorkers. I used to like New York itself when I was 14, 15 years old. I thought at one point in my life I was going to live in New York. But then when people were telling me stories about their apartment buildings with no water, black mold in the ceiling, people uh people acting crazy, people following you down a block, people pushing you in front of subway trains and shit. Then and then the whole thing with getting randomly slashed in the face for no reason. Um, that completely turned me off to New York City, and that made me not want to ever go back to New York City. But see, there's a challenge too with New York because the thing about New York is that most of the industry has always been in New York, and most of the jobs that people want, those competitive jobs, have have always been in New York City. And I have really seen it up front where people from New York has always been the bearer of corporations, big name corporations, and especially advertising. They take decent jobs away from other big American cities, like, of course, Baltimore, DC, Virginia, all these places that could use large corporations being in those cities. But because those corporations have a lot of money, they do business in New York, or they do business in Los Angeles, or they do business in Chicago. While the rest of the world, rest of America starves, the largest cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco, they all got corporations that give you more money and pay you a lot more than what you might make if you were living in a small city. And this is where the failure kind of comes in with New York, because New York has always prioritized corporations. You're starting to see a lot of people leave New York because New York has become unaffordable. But this love for New York that they once had in after 2001, after 9/11, that's slowly dissipating, and it's coming back to where what it originally was, where everybody completely disliked New York City. And with Dominican Republic, which used to have a very slow pace of life, it overwhelmingly is being influenced by New York, and of course Miami, because they're all close in proximity. But most Miami people are New York City transplants that moved to Florida. So, like I said, like New York has still has overwhelming influence over why certain cities get extremely expensive. Because now I'm starting to see it's like a lot of people coming from New York want to move to DC, want to move to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is experiencing gentrification because of a lot of New York transplants. Um, Early 2010, you didn't see a lot of people living in South Philly. South Philly used to have affordable homes in the early 2010s. Now you got homes in New York City, well, not New York, but Philadelphia, that's running over $500,000. And it's because mainly because New Yorkers have made it extremely expensive because they decided, well, I'll go live in Philly and commute from Philadelphia to New York. So then you started getting more people moving to Philadelphia, and then you started seeing Philadelphia start coming back. Lots of artsy people started moving down there and started having their own art parties and art galleries, and people from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, moving to Passyunk and what's that, Fishtown in Northeast Philly, then set up shop there. And then now, because of the redevelopment, New Philadelphia has become even more expensive. And the same thing has started trickling down to Delaware, and then of course, then you got them coming to Baltimore. Now, my city has an influx of New Yorkers coming in and buying up the real estate and driving up the price. So now you're going to start to see Baltimore get more and more expensive, and the locals get priced out of those pieces of real estate. And it should never, ever happened like that. But it's happened and it continues to happen. And that's what I find very troubling about New York, and one reason why I can't stand the city itself. I think a lot of people had what was called 9/11 syndrome. I think, in a sense, New York got its love from the fact that 9/11 happened and nobody wanted to criticize New York for a very long time. And I feel like that honeymoon is starting to kind of fade off because people are starting to realize New York ain't worth it to fucking live there. So they decide, well, okay, well, I'm just gonna pack up my stuff and get out of here and maybe even move to New Jersey. Now, New Jersey ain't even affordable no more. So then they're trying to move from there to Philly, and then from Philly to Baltimore, and then from Baltimore to DC, and then from DC to Richmond. And then most of them are settling in North Carolina. There's never been yuppies walking dogs on Light Street in my city. Now they have doggy parks. You start to notice this. I'm like, when the fuck have you seen a doggy park in Baltimore? I ain't seen no doggy park in Baltimore. Now they fucking got doggy parks in Baltimore. I can't. And that's what troubles me. Like I just couldn't bring myself to completely understand why New York has to influence everything in the United States. But it has for a long time, and now we're starting to see it wane off. Now it's turning into hatred for New York. And just when I think New York was special, it really isn't. It's overhyped just like everything else, just like Los Angeles is overhyped. Everybody wants to move to LA or everybody wants to move to San Francisco and be in Silicon Valley. But you never hear about local businesses or small businesses contributing to the economy. But you always hear about these. It's like New York gave birth to elitism, and in the process of capitalism now is that because New York has this overwhelming influence over the economy, our ship can go up with them or down with them. And we learned that from the 2008 financial crisis. But also, we learned that with Donald Trump, somebody that was born and raised in New York. He has a brash way of dealing with things. And that New York attitude still comes out in nefarious ways. And I think it's time, as really as a nation, to start ridding ourselves of New York and getting rid of the mentality. You got brothers over there, they always got to show off, or they all think they're special because they're from New York. But thing about New York is the worst type of New Yorkers are the ones that never get out of New York, but they're also the ones that never really left New York behind. They just took their mentality with them. They didn't leave it back where they got it from. A lot of people in Baltimore and DC, we don't like New York for various reasons. One, because a lot of the people cut from New York came down to Baltimore during the late 80s and early 90s and started setting up drug territories between DC and Baltimore and also Philadelphia. They all were coming down during those time periods and selling crack and pushing crack on the streets. Where at the time the main drug down here was heroin. But when crack came, it seemed like it pushed cities to become even more and more dangerous. And it was because New York drug dealers were coming down and pushing in on territory. And also, a lot of DC people don't like New Yorkers because of what happened to Rayful Edmond. And I remember hearing stories about New Yorkers not being welcome in DC. People from New York always getting shot when they come down here. There used to be a time when people liked New Yorkers, and then anybody from New York, they got they come down here and they get killed real quick with the quickness. You know, I remember hearing this story about this 13-year-old girl that came from New York, and she went to visit her family in Baltimore in Murphy Homes. And what happened was the week that she met with her grandparents in Murphy Homes, they killed her and threw her body down a trash chute and then threw her in a dumpster. And that's what became the ruthless thing about Baltimore versus New York. The sheer dislike, and I know there's no reason to bring harm to a child, but when it comes to the story of Baltimore and why Baltimoreans don't like New Yorkers, that was kind of like the one example of a story that I know that was the primary reason why most of us down here don't have any animosity for New Yorkers. And being that, you know, we're vastly different because we come from Southerners do things differently than New Yorkers. We're not brash like New Yorkers. You piss one of us off one time, you're gone. Simple as that. And that's one of the things about us that people don't understand. We're not with the bullshit. Baltimoreans do things differently. So when you think about it, when you think about it, Southerners and New Yorkers, we're vastly different. We have space. We don't live on top of each other. We have ethnically segregated neighborhoods. In their neighborhoods, if the Puerto Rican kid was living next door to them, they might have static or they might have beef, but then they're forced to get along with each other because they're the only ones living in that building. People get bullied. It's what happens. I've had New Yorkers in my life that I was cool with, but then I realized I even dated one girl from New York, and I know for a fact I will never ever date another New York girl ever again because New Yorkers act like they got options and they act like they're better than everybody else, and that's the honest truth, you know. And then it's the hyper masculinity of the women too. New Yorkers, because New Yorkers live in a city, they tend to have a exterior or facade with themselves that make them look tough. And most New York women always try to act like they're tough. And I've never understood that. But then I understand it now because New York is a tough city to grow up in. People come at you. You know, you come at somebody down in Baltimore, you getting your ass whooped. That's just simple. So certain people you just don't come at. New Yorkers, they come at everybody. And New Yorkers are many of them are mentally unstable, which is one primary reason why why I haven't gone back to New York in a long time because there's just this level of mental instability that exists within the city that people don't really take into account. But despite some of the beautiful women in New York, I would never want to date anybody from New York ever again. I had that experience. I went through it. I will never do that shit again. Plain and simple. But that's one of the primary reasons why I can't stand niggas from New York, people from New York. Because it's just arrogant. I used to have love for New York. I was like, damn, this is nice. First time you get out of Baltimore and you see something different, you kind of realize, eh, this is different, but it ain't as different as we wanted to see. But me being from Baltimore and then taking trips with my family down in North Carolina, I started having a more appreciation for the South than I did for the North because down South, everything is just open fields and open everything. And you could run around, you could play, nothing really nothing really impacts you that much in North Carolina or Florida. Being by a beach or Virginia Beach, going to the beach and being by a beach and stuff like that, you know, and being around that, your lifestyle is going to be a lot more laid back and it's going to be a lot more different. Imagine being around a New Yorker all the time. Anywhere you go, they fucking paranoid. A lot of New Yorkers are very paranoid people. They always got to look over their shoulder. They always got to feel like somebody coming at them. And girls be the same way too. Always thinking somebody coming at them. Always thinking somebody hating on them. That's one of the primary reasons why I don't date girls from New York. Cause I'd be saying hi to one and they snap off on you. Like girls literally snap off on you because they think you're a threat. I couldn't mess with that. One thing you don't want is to date somebody from New York because your whole life will be a living hell. You'll be constantly walking on eggshells. That's definitely something I don't want to have to live with in any relationship. I want to thank you for listening. Me is Talk TB. I'm Tony J. Make sure you hit the like, share, and subscribe. Um, hit the comment box. Tell me what you think. Can you stand New York people? Can you stand them? Can you tolerate them, or you can't stand them at all? Because I could tell you, I've grown tired of New York City. I've grown tired of it. I've been to Brooklyn. I've been to Queens. Well, I haven't been to Queens. I've been to Harlem. Only place I won't go is the Bronx. I'm not going to the Bronx. Ain't no fucking way. All them people you see on Third Avenue look like fucking junkies and shit. Nope. Ain't doing that. It's probably one reason why I would mess with people from Atlanta and Florida, because at least Atlanta and Florida got some decency, but they've even Atlanta and Florida have even lost some of what makes them unique as Southerners because a lot of New York people, like I said, have been moving down to Atlanta and New York and Charlotte and have caused irreparable damage to the Southern culture of those cities. Hell, even Atlanta is not no longer affordable anymore. Atlanta is full. Atlanta is getting gentrified, and Atlanta is going through some process of gentrification. But I want to start a conversation on this. Tell me what y'all think. You know, Media Talks TV. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video. Peace.